So I'm here to talk to you about use authentication for winners and pros. I got a lot of feedback from the first slide. I rectified some of this in slide number 2. For it being a password field, you actually want to start it out. And sometimes this actually happens where, as developers, we're like in the middle of code, writing code and whatnot, and you forget like simple stuff like this. So, like I was introduced, my name is Karthik. I live here in Austin, and I'm a senior web software engineer. My journey is interesting because I started off as just a web developer, did a lot of e-commerce kind of applications at National Instruments, and then when we started doing a lot of cloud stuff, I was fortunate enough to be on that team, and one of the first things we needed was authentication. So I got to write a lot of those modules and look at cloud authentication and authorization and whatnot. So a lot of this talk comes from like the experiences I've had from that. I think I spent it's been about 4 years now since I've been looking at this space. So just a lot of developer thoughts from that stuff. I want to do a quick audience survey to understand my audience. So if it's just humor me for a second. How many developers do we have in the audience? Just a quick show of hands. Okay, lots of devs. Like DevOps, operations. Okay, a few. Security folks, like hardcore security. Okay, so it's probably half and half. How about like management or, I don't know, other stuff, other titles? Okay, so that's good. So it's kind of in the ballpark. So my agenda was for developers and DevOps folks who actually write a lot of code. I wanted to talk about building good systems, for building good auth systems. For security pros, give you some developer insights. Like a lot of times when I go to security conferences, I realize security people developers don't seem to be getting our perspective and whatnot. And so I kind of wanted, and a lot of the tools that are used in the field of security are things that developers don't see, but I kind of wanted to give you guys some insight on how we think about some problems. And for management or people in management who need authentication systems or whatever, just give this presentation to your dev teams. So there's many ways to authenticate stuff. The 3 big ones out there right now are you can either write your own. Let's say you have a website, you're trying to write out an auth system, you can write your own. There's a bunch of stuff there's OpenID, and then there's OAuth. So OpenID is the thing where a lot of websites used to use this before, where you authenticate with something, username, password, an OpenID username, password, and use that. OAuth is more, hey, log in with Facebook or whatever. For the purposes of this presentation, I'm going to talk specifically more about writing your own and not about the other 2. OpenID is kind of dying/dead. OAuth is actually becoming more popular just because nobody wants to deal with this. It's actually kind of complicated, so nobody wants to deal with storing username, passwords, and you hear about leaks all the time now. So the common perception in all of this is, if you talk to somebody in management who's wanting to build out a website, they're like, this is easy, it's just username, password, you store it somewhere, and then whenever somebody comes in, you log in with that. What's the big deal? When you break it down, there's you can say that's not really true or whatever, but when you break it down, it's a bunch of different pieces that come together. So there's an API for log in, log out. I prefer to think of it from a platform as a service perspective, because a lot of the stuff that we do, it's cloud hosted, cloud enabled. So having an API to get to your login services or your session-based services is a lot better than having all of that stuff inside of an application. For example, in Java, having a jar or whatever. There's some workflows associated with that. So password reset's an example, and then the user interface, how you actually get to all of that stuff. So I think these slides kind of go into a little bit more detail. API, login, log out, session management, blah blah blah. Workflows, how the system actually works, and then user interface, what the end user actually sees. So some details on that. From a high level design, the only reason I want to talk about this is because most of the stuff I talk about is kind of talks about these pieces. So when you have when you write out one of these systems, there's typically some kind of data store where your data is actually stored. There's API, so there's web services API in order to get to that. So like the login, logout stuff that I talked about. You might have some emails that you send out for password reset emails or account what's the word, like account activation emails or things like that. And then there's the applications that use it. So there's, like app one will use your past kind of web services to talk to your database to know whether a user is authenticated, whatnot. And then it's your end users will, actually talk to those applications. So a lot of this stuff is behind the scenes when you have web services. So a quick look at the data, like what kind of data is stored in here. It's really straightforward, right? There's email, there might be a username. Email might be the username to begin with, first name, last name, password, maybe some kind of ID that links it to your database. Oh, I forgot to mention one thing. So every time there's like a little light bulb thingy up there, the light bulb thingy basically is for developers. And then there's another thing where it says like keep calm and hack on or something, and those are for security pros. So this is more of a developer tip. So you want to keep your authentication data separate from all the other stuff. So you don't want to cluster. Let's say you're part of like a big e-commerce shop or something like that. You don't want to have like all of your data, e-com data associated with your user data in the same table. This is not rocket science. I mean, it's just, if you ask a DBA, it's like, yeah, this is normalization, dude. What are you talking about? Really straightforward. So let's go into a little bit more detail. Web services. So the goal of web services when you're doing stuff like login, logout, session management is you want to keep your user credentials as safe as possible. In general, you want to keep it as safe as possible, but also in transit, you want to keep that as safe as well. So if we take a little bit deeper look, this is probably the most complicated slide I have. You have a request that an application. So let's say in this scenario, somebody wants to log in. So they have an app that the user's interacting with. They send a request to a post login service which has an encoded username password. It goes to these web services behind the scenes. Depending on whether the username password was like a good pair, it responds with either an HTTP 200 or 201 with a session token, some kind of expiration with that session token, and maybe a first name, last name. So in your application, you can say hello, hello whatever. And this is just like I typically like to use REST-based services for this stuff because it makes things really easy. But it can be SOAP protocol or whatever you want, as long as there's like some kind of request and response. And then in the case of when you have, so the first time you log in, you pass your username, password. The second time, because you've gotten a session token back, you don't actually need to send that username, password over again, and you're just validating for that specific session token. So in this case, you have a GET request on login and the session token that you had initially, and a response of 200 or 201, and a 401 failure if that token was invalid. Since that token expires, like you can set whatever kind of expiration you want on it. So let's say if you set like 24 hours, then that like after 24 hours, that call would respond with the 401. And so your end application would know whether that token that you have is a good or bad thing. So this helps out in the case where, I think the next slide is, yeah, this helps out in the case where you don't send username passwords over the wire a lot. You get a token back and you're like, okay, so I have this token, I can use it going forward. And a lot of this is based on OpenID kind of works that way, but there's a thing in between. So it's like the three spoke model. So this is kind of like that, but there's only like two parties involved. And the only benefit of doing something like that is, you don't want to send people's like personal credential information over the wire all the time. And it's harder to, from a hacker perspective, it's harder to sniff because it's not always there. It's there in the first request, but not in the ones after. A couple other tips in here: don't put this in the URL. So when you have like login, you're posting it, so you don't want to put username and password in the URL, mostly because the server logs will cache that stuff, and then so if somebody looks at your server logs, they have like access to all the username passwords or whoever's logged in, in that period. Session tokens, again, set an expiration time, because if you don't set that, then and somebody gets that session token, which is used a lot, they kind of have access to the system again. And probably the most important thing in here is all of this stuff is great, but it doesn't work if you just have HTTP, because HTTP can be sniffed. You want to use HTTPS. So I kind of put this meme in there. You want to stay encrypted. So here, if you talk to our friend Joe Hacker, he's like, great, so you have an API, APIs are awesome. I can just brute force this thing. I can just brute force the login endpoint. I have this list of usernames, I have this list of passwords. I'll just brute force this and kill your services, right? But this is where something like rate limiting can come into play. How many of y'all went to the Zane Lackey talk yesterday? Okay, so a few of y'all. In that talk, we talked about rate limiting. Rate limiting is basically where you have some kind of API. It only allows X number of calls to that API per minute or per hour or whatever. It's things that you can set. And so let's say your login endpoint you can submit 100 or maybe 100 login calls over the course of 5 minutes. That's what you set. If it goes to over 101 or 110 or something like that, the server just responds and say, hey, you're asking me this too many times. I'm not sure about this. I don't trust you. Because typically, if you think about it from a user perspective, they might forget the password once, twice, 5 times, but 100 times it seems a little bit fishy. So it basically blocks you and says, okay, for 5 minutes or 10 minutes or whatever that is, don't talk to me, and then I can talk to you. You can talk to me after that. And there's some strategies. So I put a link in here. Nick Galbraith, who gave the keynote yesterday, he has a really good article, blog post on rate limiting. So I would check that out. Some caveats with it is rate limiting initially when you implement it, it might be a little bit difficult because there's a lot of code that you have to think about, especially if you have distributed servers and whatnot. It's a little bit hard to implement up front, but it's totally recommended and then usable in all of your other APIs as well. So take a look at that. Session tokens. Session tokens, let's talk about this for a second. When you have, so everybody knows about the RAN function and the grid function, right? You don't want to use to generate your session token, which is a random number, you don't want to use something like random grid. And you don't want to do this because they're not cryptographically secure. Maybe I should drink some more water. And you want to keep them 128 bits or greater. There's a blog, I think I had this in the slides, but Mozilla actually has a blog of recommendations, not blog, but they have a article on best practices for authentication and web apps. And this is some of the information I pulled from there where you want to keep it 128 bits or greater. That's all that is saying is it's a really large randomized token, which is also cryptographically secure. All that does is it's harder to crack. So it's not just something random, and there's enough randomness in it for it to be something that would work for these kind of scenarios. So we've talked a lot about this stuff right now, and I kind of want to give there's some hacks that you can do, and some of the stuff I've seen before, and I just want to talk through it. As developers, we make mistakes, and some of the stuff is good to just think about, in order to stop you from making mistakes, to build stronger systems. But also from the flip side, when the security pros are testing applications, this is something that they can think about. So, so what we talked about so far is we have an endpoint where you submit your username, password, gives you back a session token. Then you have the session token that you keep using for a 24-hour period, right? So the hack here is create 2 accounts. This is hypothetical, but you can create 2 accounts, and log in. So typically applications dump cookies. So take those cookies and just kind of keep them and take a look at them. And so then one of the things you can try is with one session token and the other, try to trade them with the emails and see what happens. This is because sometimes it might happen this way. And this is a piece of code that I have over here where you have you have get dashboard. You can think of dashboard as some kind of page where you say, is session valid? Request cookie for session ID. And you're like, okay, so I get the session ID from that, and then do some stuff over here. Does anyone see anything wrong over here, or like anything weird that strikes out at you if this was the application? I'll give you a hint. So basically, they take the session ID and then they do some stuff, and then they get some more data with email, and then display it out over here. So this is the display function, and this is the actual function that goes and like processes all of your data. What's up?
Are we not trusting the email?
Yes. So if you look at this workflow, I mean, logically it's great because you're looking at this and you're like, is the session valid? Hey, yeah, the session ID is valid. And then it's like, okay, go from the cookies, go and take the email, and then give me all the data, like in this case, user compiles for that specific email, and then display it, right? Logically, it's great, but you don't really trust the session cookies or the cookies for either session ID or email. So one of the things you want to check here is, okay, I got back a session ID. Is the session ID or is the email that is in the session ID also the same email that somebody has or somebody's trying to like submit to me? So it's one of those things you want to kind of keep track of. From a dev perspective, a lot of times you just kind of forget. You're like, oh, okay, yeah, here's information piece number 1, information piece number 2, and you're like, put it together and the app works, and then you're like, wait a minute, this doesn't quite work in some of these scenarios, and the application becomes open to you hacking. Does that make sense? Yes?
Yes.
Cool. Okay. Session number 2, make sure that these things actually expire. So you have a logout endpoint. A lot of times when you write applications, there's the logout button in the app, you click that, and then all that does is, it clears your cookies. But it doesn't actually go back and tell the server, hey, for all of these tokens, or for this specific token that you have, go and expire that. So go and say, okay, it's valid for 24 hours, but the user's told me that he wants to expire that, so immediately expire that. So in this case, you want to make sure that when you hit logout, not only do you clear that user cookies at that point in time, but also take that session ID and like clear it out, so it can be used in the future. All right, so let's move on. So we have account creation, password reset, some more workflows. And when you're designing these systems out, typically you work with a lot of designers. And so this is John Ivey, right? And he's big as usability guy. He's like, we try and solve very like complicated problems, but we want to take this away from the user perspective and make it simple. And he's like super well respected. So a lot of the usability people on your team will be like, read this stuff. And they're like, okay, so usability Jack and Jill. They'll be like, okay, so remembering passwords is really difficult. So instead of doing like 8-character passwords, let's just do 4. It's more usable. And they're like, but Jonathan Ivey said that you want to keep this like simple, and people don't remember all this stuff, right? And this actually happens. So like when you work with usability folks and security folks, like it's like a disaster waiting to happen, because the place that people come from is so very different. So there's no common ground. If you all are in a situation like this, one recommendation I have is there's actually a really good book. It's called Security and Usability, and it talks about things from both of those perspectives. That's something I would check out. But the most important thing from a security point of view is, I would say, the days of the 4-character password. It's like long gone. That was maybe like 2003. We've come a long way. I think your end users and end customers get that now, because when they look at auth systems, they're like, well, this is weird that it's the password strength of this is only 4 characters. So it's actually like a negative thing as opposed to a positive thing like before, where you could have ABCD or whatever. But when you're having these discussions with your UX teams, things you want to say is, hey, most good systems out there today have an A+ character strength password, in place. You can show them by example. And the other thing that people don't think about, it's weird, but instead of using just simple words to try and string together, just use a sentence instead to make that password character string. So just some tips on working with usability teams or people in your organization who might have a different view. Like, don't have just a security view of it, kind of like a holistic view. These are some tips you can use. So let's move on and talk about account creation. So typically, when you create an account, you get some data from the user, and then you provision the account, right? So some really basic stuff for both devs and for security folks: sanitize your inputs, because excess, it's out there, and that's probably like the most common thing that happens with applications. If you're asking for an email address, make sure you validate that, because what's the point of asking for an email address if you're really not going to do anything with it, or you're not going to validate it? Because then anyone can sign up with anyone else's email address. It doesn't really make sense. And there may, like in a lot of times when I've seen auth systems, what I've seen is there might be like different data stores. Like, you might store your credentials in like an LDAP system or whatever, and you might store all of this in a MySQL database or something like that. So you have like different data stores in play. One interesting thing to note here is when that does happen, like occasionally you'll see, when you register with like the same email address but have different casing on it, the system might accept that and might send you like multiple emails, one for a user in like lowercase and one for it in like uppercase. So make sure you have that check in place. And if you're testing it, make sure you test both of those scenarios, because it's weird when that happens. Also, a really weird thing that we saw was we were storing a lot of this data in LDAP, and I think we were using like LDAP version 2, which is super old. I don't think anybody uses that anymore. But version 2 had like trouble with foreign characters. You could store it in there, but when you took it back out, it would be all like garbled. So when you register for an account, try and use like a Japanese name or something like that, or Japanese characters, and you'll notice, if you notice weirdness, then you might find out that that's an LDAP system. What you do with that information, I don't really know, but I think that could be interesting. Passwords. Okay. So storing passwords. I don't know if you all are fans of Macklemore and the thrift shop song, but if you were going to use passwords, and if the only thing you store was clear text passwords, then your management might not be so very happy with you. Come on, guys, it's okay to laugh. But if you flip it around, if you're like, what does the fox say? The fox will be like, well, don't use the thrift shop analogy here, because that's terrible. Don't do it. So best practices on some of this stuff, only store hash passwords. Use a unique per user salt. So when you store a hash password, I'll go into this a little bit more detail, but you want to use you don't just want to hash it, but you also want to use a salt when you hash the password. You also don't want to use one salt for all the passwords in your data store. You want to use it per user. And then when you're generating your hash, you want to use something like bcrypt or scrypt. Those are a little bit more computationally intensive, but at the same time, I think it's worthwhile because you're trying to protect that data. And so, Joe Hacker comes along and he's like, well, that's great, but I'll just like get all your cloud database credentials, and then bam, you're kind of screwed. And some of this, and this is a realistic scenario, because a lot of times, like LinkedIn, for example, last year, they got a list of username and passwords, but even though the passwords were all encrypted, they still had that list. So one of the interesting techniques that I really like, and I read about, I think last year, was it's from this company called Stormpath, and Stormpath is they're kind of in this space. But the technique that I really liked here was, okay, so we have a password hash, we have we have a hash, and then we have a salt, and we have like number of times you're kind of like iterating on that to generate that hash. like break that up and store it into and put it into different data stores. So you put your hash word in one store, put your salt in a different store, put the number of iterations in store number 3, and then you might also want to put like if an application is accessing it, you can put the MAC in like a different place. All this is doing is if one of your databases is compromised, the person is not getting all the different pieces to like figure out the logic that goes behind, how your application is, or how that password might be hashed. So it's an interesting way of approaching the same problem, and it makes things harder from a hacker perspective. And I put a whole bunch of like different things. Like these are things that I've read in the past, and I just put like a bunch of things in there. So let's move on to reset and restore. Cool. So password reset. So there's two camps, right? A lot of applications that you might have seen before, they do a password reset. Some apps do like, hey, what's your, where were you born or something like that, the password restore kind of thing. And there's like ideologies behind which thing you want to use. So I sit in the password reset camp because the challenge questions that sites throw at me, they're not really like challenging anymore, because you might be friends with somebody on Facebook or whatever, and then they can be like, oh, okay, yeah, I know that guy's mom's name, so I can like type that in. That's his maiden name. Hopefully your friends are not trying to hack you, but you kind of get the point of your data is not really like your personal data anymore. It's kind of a little bit more open in the society that we live in. Also, but when you do use password reset, make sure that the token, so a lot of times you'll get an email, right? So you'll say password reset / some like crazy token ID. And then when you click on that, it takes you to the site where you can reset your password. Make sure that that token, like once it's used, so once somebody like resets that password, that's actually expired. So it doesn't, so if somebody else got that email later on and they try to reset it or something like that, it wouldn't work. So make sure it's just like one time only and expiring super fast. So if somebody doesn't reset a password in say like, I don't know, 24 hours, like that's not really valid. So let's take a poll. So when you create an account, and everyone in this room has probably created accounts before, you might have seen two different workflows, right? So you get the page with the form where you put in some user credentials, then you get an email and you set up your password. And there might be a different way where you put all your credentials, including your password, in there, and then you get the email and you log in. Any thoughts on which of these might be like a superior way of doing things? Or do you guys have a preference on one versus the other? How many people like method number 1 or way number 1? All right, how many people like way number 2? And how many people don't care at all? Okay, cool. So turns out that for everyone who is in camp number 2 or don't care, this is actually a winner, because when you do this, if you think of the first scenario where you put in information, you go to your email, wait for some data, or wait for some time for the email to come, then you click a thing to enter your password, it takes a longer amount of time, and so there's a larger user drop-off. And so that's why, from a usability perspective, way number 2 wins, because you put all your info, you can't log into the site yet because you haven't actually like verified your email, but you're just waiting to get that email to verify, and it takes you to the login page. So once again, like the people at Stormpath, they actually ran this both ways, and they were, like once they switched from like the first way to the second way, and they had a 27% more user completion. User completion. So it's just, and when we designed this at the time, we struggled with this because we were like, well, this seems better than this because it just seems like this seems more secure, and I think it is, but it also, the pain in like waiting for an email or like for it to go to spam or something like that is a lot higher. So most people are like, forget it, I don't want to log into this site, or I don't want to register with this site at all. And that's why I think this other way might be a little bit better. So final thoughts. Running ahead of time, but that's a good thing because people want to go to lunch. I finished my presentation, and then I was like, there's a whole bunch of things I want to talk about, but there's nowhere like good to put it, so I just kind of like freestyled the last few things over here. Oh yes, okay. So usability, coming back to that, if you're in a large enterprise and you're the team that owns the login services, and you have like a whole bunch of like application teams that are trying to create these applications, you want to make sure that when they implement a login form, they look consistent across the site, like across your entire site. So like the e-commerce stuff, or the e-commerce applications and your catalog applications and whatever your sales applications kind of have the same login screen. Because if they don't, then like from a user perspective, it looks a little bit weird and doesn't seem consistent, and it seems like the company that they're trying to work with doesn't have their act together. So that's kind of that's something to think about. And they start losing trust, right? So I'll pick on Netflix for a second. If you look at their login screens across, they I think Jason said they have like 1,000 different devices. They look pretty much the same across everything. So, but if you wanted to like log into Netflix on your iPhone versus from the website, and if like the login screens looked a little bit different, like one was green and one was red, you'd be like, hey, what's going on here? Is this really Netflix? You don't really end up knowing. So that's just an example. Yes, so Apache Shiro. If you're a Java shop and you're trying to implement some of this login stuff, take a look at Apache Shiro. It actually helps you. It's a framework that helps you with like the authentication and then authentication, like password reset and whatnot. So it's kind of made for the authentication use case, like authentication and authorization as well. So take a look at that because it might be of some use for y'all. The SaaS version of that is called Stormpath, and Stormpath has a good blog of just a lot of tips associated with building some of these systems out. Two-factor. So two-factor authentication. How many people in the audience actually use two-factor auth on Google? So that's actually a good number. And this is gaining a lot of traction where it definitely increases the security aspect of things. Where if you're trying to like log into Gmail from a laptop or desktop or some device that you've never used before, you get this notification on your phone saying, hey, you're trying to log in, is this really you? And you actually have to punch that number into the web browser. I think that from the usability perspective, it's still kind of like people are like, well, but now you're like asking for something via phone. Is the text message actually going to go across? So there's some challenges from that perspective, but I think it's still a really good idea. And also, I think this is my last final thought, but a lot of places now have like a login dashboard. So you log into like my profile, and there's a little dashboard in there saying, hey, you last logged into this app at 24 hours ago from this location. And initially, I think from a user point of view, people were like, well, the app knows what I'm doing. That used to be how people would feel about this stuff, like maybe 5 years ago. But now people are like, well, I want to know if for some reason this app has said that I logged into it from China or something like that. And so I think the trend is shifting more towards people wanting to see some of this information of geolocation timestamp and things like that. And from a developer perspective, like we have all that information with us anyways. Like you can tell from your logs, where that request came from and what time it came. So why not show the users? And yes, this is my last slide. So OAuth, right? I didn't really touch much on that, but a lot of times, with brand new applications, you're like, yeah, I'll just use my Facebook login for this or Twitter login, and it goes to that screen where it's like, hey, this app wants to be able to read your data and write to your data. One of the questions, like Kirk is over here, is like, well, why does this need to write to my Facebook account when this is just supposed to be like, I don't know, reading about movies or whatever? So think about that, because there's been a lot of exploits on this stuff recently where an application gets hacked and then that OAuth token goes kind of like wild and crazy out in the open. Well, not out in the open, like you can still take that away, but they start like fishing for more information and more of your personal information. So kind of think about that a little bit more. So when you want to find whether a user is licensed for a specific software package or whatever, you can take the session token that you get back with, when you log into the application, take that session token and then link that potentially to a user ID that links it to what privileges the user has. So more like the authorization use case. So that's kind of one of the ways you can get to, oh, okay, so here's the user and here's what, the different things that he can access, or he or she or that app can access. That's one way. The other way is authentication. When you want to do something like OAuth, you can kind of set up your OAuth tokens to have specific privileges and say, okay, so this app has the privilege to read this kind of data, and then kind of like set up privileges yourself or whatever you think those use cases might be. You could have multiple sample tokens or something, like two that mean different things. The other use case that we kind of had where we had API keys, but users could configure whether an API key was like read only or write only or things like that. And so you had the token, but then you can kind of configure what that actually meant. And then there's a whole like different system for that altogether. But once you log in with a specific username and password, you can link to, hey, okay, you have access to tokens now. Okay, this token means this thing in there, kind of deal. It's not like, I don't think it's like super elegant, but it definitely addresses a lot of different points in there. Any other questions? Going once, going twice. All right, well, I'll be here if you guys need me. But if not, have a good lunch, and thank you for attending.